So now I'm going to be moving us into our feature presentation for the evening. It's called A Day in the Life of Remedial Action and the Community Impacts Mitigation Plan, which we're also calling the CIMP or the CIMP. So note that we will be recording this presentation and posting it to our YouTube, so you will have an opportunity to watch it again if that is your preference. We're going to have Caleb Schaefer, the Portland Harbor team lead, provide us with a presentation this evening to introduce you to the concept of a CIMP and why one is needed for the Portland Harbor cleanup, as well as discuss next steps for the development of the document itself and how EPA will follow up on the feedback received at tonight's meeting. So once we're through his presentation, we're going to move into breakout rooms to get some informal feedback from all of the collaborative group members on the impacts that you think might be good for EPA to consider for a CIMP. During Caleb's presentation, I just want to ask that members, if you could put your comments and questions into the chat. We'll pause at the end of the presentation, and if there's time to address these, we will. If we run out of time, which is highly likely just given all the things we're covering tonight, we'll ask you to take those questions and comments into the breakout room from 7 to 8, which we'll all be at during that time. Okay. So for observers or non-members, I just wanted to let you know that if you can hold any of your chat messages or verbal questions that you may have to get to that breakout room between 7 and 8, we just kindly ask that you do that so that we can reserve the space for the members. Okay, so logistics aside, I'm going to hand it over to Caleb to run us through his slides and overview.
Actually, I'm going to quickly intro Caleb first. Thanks, Annie. So I think most of you know me, but if you don't, my name is Laura Neeson, and I'm the EPA Community Involvement Coordinator for the Portland Harbor Superfund site. And just very quickly, I want to say that Caleb is going to do most of the talking, but I'll come back at the end of the activity that we'll be doing later to get feedback. And this topic came up as one of a lot of interest on the Portland Harbor Collaborative Steering Committee. So I just want to thank the community members on that steering committee who put forward this topic and helped us think about this as a good topic to develop. So with that said, I'm going to pass it off to Caleb. And I just wanted to say Caleb and I and the rest of the team are working on the Community Impacts Mitigation Plan scoping. We do not have a draft of it yet, but Caleb will talk more about that later. Thank you. And Caleb, go for it.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Annie. Next slide. So tonight's learning objectives here are up here. First, we're hoping by the end of the session, you'll understand what to expect during the active cleanup portion at this Superfund site. Secondly, we hope you'll learn how the Superfund process accounts for community impacts. And third, we hope you'll provide feedback to EPA on how community members might be impacted during the active cleanup. And I'd like to just take the opportunity to pause and say in tonight's presentation and in the breakout room, I'm joined by Warda Azar. Warda is the CDM Smith technical lead for environmental cleanup. And CDM Smith is the contractor that EPA's hired to support EPA in its oversight role of this cleanup. Warda will be available to answer questions tonight in the breakout room or during the main presentation if we have time as well. So welcome, Warda. Next slide, please. Here's the agenda for tonight. First, we're going to talk about what do we know about the active cleanup and its potential impact to the community. Second, how does the Superfund process typically account for community impacts? Third, what are the proposed steps for addressing community impacts of the active cleanup? And fourth, we have an interactive activity, and we're really hoping to have folks think about how the active cleanup may impact your community and provide feedback to us, because that's really going to help us inform the community impacts mitigation plan. Next slide. So the first section is what do we know about the active cleanup? Well, you know, we all know this is a large, complex cleanup. It's a Superfund site. Sites receive that designation because they're the largest, most complex contaminated sites in the country. So this is no exception. And this cleanup, it's estimated to take approximately 13 years to actually perform the active cleanup. Further, it's anticipated the cleanup will remove 5 million tons of sediment from the bottom of the river and the riverbanks of contaminated material. And just to give folks an idea of kind of the volume of that, that translates to 300,000 dump trucks of material. Now, I provide that example for illustrative purposes. We don't intend to move it all via dump trucks, and we'll talk about that a little later. But hopefully that kind of gives folks an idea of the volume of material that will be leaving the site and moving to safe disposal in a landfill. It involves lots of heavy equipment, both on the river and on the banks of the river, and we'll be talking more about that tonight. It potentially involves 24-hour operations to complete the work. We have very limited fish windows where work can be conducted. So there's a strong desire to opportunize that and actually complete this cleanup in those 13 years. Next slide. So this is a picture of what a typical environmental dredge project looks like. Environmental dredging involves specialized equipment, and that's for the purpose of safe and precise removal of contaminated material. So what you see in this picture is, you see your standard lattice crane there. There's a dredge bucket that's attached to that. There are associated barges. So there is that dredge bucket that's being lowered by the crane down to the bottom of the river, picking up material, lifting it up and moving it onto a barge. And so there's often a couple barges. There's support vessels that are moving barges like tugboats that you can see in this picture. And there's often smaller boats just moving people, other smaller boats in the vicinity that are performing monitoring, things like water quality monitoring. So this kind of paints a picture of what the activity looks like. Dredging and picking up this material causes some turbidity. Turbidity's typically not good because that's suspended silt and sediment. It blocks light to aquatic plants. It can smother aquatic organisms. It can potentially spread contaminants. So we have other measures in place when we do this type of dredging that provides protections. And what's not shown in this picture that you can see clearly is we would typically have a turbidity containment, like something like a silt curtain or a turbidity curtain that surrounds it and contains the stirred up sediment from the bottom as that dredge bucket picks up that material from the bottom. You also would often have a boom, a floating barrier on the top. So oftentimes when a dredge bucket can go down, there's lots of things that are at the bottom of that river, as we know, from cars to bicycle to wood. Things like wood that can get dislodged and float to the surface, any sort of oily material, that actually can then be contained within that boom that's floating on the surface. So it's really intended, these protections are intended for containing any sort of impact from this material. Next slide. So now we're going to actually show a video of what you saw in that last picture, and we'll be playing it now. So you can hear it's diesel engines. Dredge bucket is picking up material and putting it on a barge. There's 17 different project areas, and activity is going to start in a couple project areas and ramp up. So there could be multiple operations like this occurring at once on the river. I mentioned that active construction work window, and that taking advantage of that and incorporating 24-hour dredging. And so that active work window is July 1st through October 31st for all in-water work, and December 1st through January 31st for deep water navigation dredging. And those are for the protection of fish within the river, and the 24-hour operations will really allow to kind of maximize cleanup within that 6-month period that work can actually occur within the river. So you saw from this video, there's obvious nuisances that could occur. Things like odor. You saw kind of that diesel emission come out of the crane. No noise. light, especially if it is indeed 24-hour operations. Those often require are accommodated with light on trees that are overseeing the barges in the work area. So obvious, clearly potential impacts associated with this activity. Next slide. So that last video wasn't a specialized environmental dredge bucket, and what we're going to see here is what a specialized environmental dredge bucket looks like in operation. So we'll go ahead and play it. This is what we anticipate most parties using. As you can see, it's a specialized bucket because it's closed on the top. The material can't come out of the top. It minimizes water removal. They're very stable. They don't move around a lot, so they can be very precise in selecting and picking up contamination. They minimize resuspension and that turbidity I previously talked about. They have sides that overlap on the bottom. So once they grasp that sediment, they seal and prevent further spillage as that bucket's being pulled up. And they have much longer flat cuts on the bottom. So it can actually go down and create a level cut on the river bottom versus, you know, more typical buckets that are smaller would go down and create like a potholing effect. So this is specialized equipment to really kind of precisely remove contamination with very little impact. Next slide. This next is a video, and it doesn't have sound to it. We'll go ahead and play it here. This is a dredge operation on the Miami River, and the intent of this is to kind of show the type of activity that would be happening on the side of the river, not in the actual river. So when the barge comes back to the side of the river, to a transload facility, so you can see it being offloaded here from the barge by that excavator and moved. Right now it's moving into the back of what's called an intermodal. So it's essentially a roll-off container, a container you see oftentimes in front of people's houses that are doing home renovation type projects. But you know, this has additional measures in place that can wrap it and contain it. It may not necessarily be intermodal like this. It could be a gondola rail car. There's rail spurs, and there's clear advantages of using rail spurs to load material. It could be barges actually moving material. So whether it's rail car, trucks, or barges, that's all still being worked out in the remedial design phase that we're in now. There's often other components of a typical transload facility that you'd see that you don't necessarily see here. A dewatering of sediment, so further removal of water, and then the treatment of that water. So a treatment facility to treat that water, and that's really to kind of minimize the moisture content, prepare it for going to the disposal site. There could potentially be some additives to that, like things oftentimes like Portland cement that's solidifying and binding that material. So some sort of processing of it to ensure that it meets the acceptability requirements of the landfill that it's ultimately going to. There could potentially be multiple transload facilities, you know, maybe one on the east side of the river, one on the west side of the river. There are real, you know, ideally associated with the rail spurs, because you know rail cars can hold a lot of material, and that infrastructure does exist within Portland Harbor. If there weren't transload facilities, you know, and we're relying on barge and truck, obviously that's not ideal because it would just potentially result in more truck traffic. All of the equipment setup of dredging, you know, there'll also be capping. So the kind of the same as happening in reverse of material leaving the site, we'll have clean material coming in the site. So clean sand that will eventually be capping surfaces. And so you'll have essentially material moving in reverse, contaminated material moving out and clean material moving into the site using this same infrastructure. Next slide. It's helpful to think about where these types of activities are going to be occurring. And so this map shows the areas being dredged from the rod. So those are the areas within the river that are kind of hatched and shaded. Those are the areas planned for active dredging. The orange areas are areas that are residential. And so, some obvious areas stand out. The residential area on the top left of that bottom map is University of Portland campus. The residential area on the top map on the bottom is Linton neighborhood that's close to the B1A project area. And certainly Willamette Cove and Cathedral Park are two areas of high interest given public access and residences near Willamette Cove. And then obviously houseless populations. There are, as we know, houseless populations along the riverbanks in some areas, and there's potential impacts to those communities as well. Next slide. So we're going to next talk about how the Superfund process accounts for community impacts. Next slide. So this is an excerpt you see here from actually our consent decree. So our consent decree is the enforcement instrument that we will put in place to oversee the cleanup. And so, EPA's thinking and process around accounting for community impacts during remedial action and cleanups at Superfund sites has continued to evolve. The most robust impacts that we have seen at a sediment site, a large sediment site, are from the Hudson River Superfund site. And we'll actually put a link to that in the chat if folks are interested in looking more at that. And at the time that cleanup was done, a cleanup it has been complete in a large portion of the river. At that time, community impacts were managed through what's called a quality of life metrics, in addition to a community health and safety plan. Now we kind of roll both those efforts into one, and we call it a community impacts mitigation plan. And you can kind of see here what the description of that is. And so if you're looking at the Hudson River documents, essentially that quality of life metrics and the community health and safety plan is what fold into what we're developing here with the community impacts mitigation plan. Next slide. Next, we'll be talking about the proposed steps for addressing community impacts of the active cleanup at Portland Harbor. Next slide. So this slide shows kind of the typical evolution and what we expect for evolution of the community impacts mitigation plan. We're really in the first stages of the plan. So we're really at that very top box there where we're identifying impacts that the cleanup may have. And the interactive exercise tonight, we hope to further that effort and get ideas that will actually help us develop the first draft of this plan. Once we've identified the community impacts, we'll identify measurable performance standards, and those are often informed by state and local construction standards. We'll also kind of incorporate associated monitoring for those impacts. How will that occur? Where will that occur? When will that occur? And this plan will also determine a process for corrective actions if any sort of measure identified is exceeded. So this could span from the range of actions from just required notifications all the way to kind of halting work and stopping it. And our goal is really to kind of establish a system that allows for course correction so work can proceed, because if we're always stopping work and we don't have active measures in place and problems are being caused, that's an issue, and it should be addressed and corrected. The time we get within to the work windows also, as I mentioned previously, is very precious because of to ensure that we're protecting fish species. And so we want to make sure and try and work that whole time within that work window and not have operations have to shut down. With a 13-year cleanup, it also kind of gives us opportunity to improve. So, this is intended to be a dynamic plan. We intend to accommodate, incorporate what we learn at the beginning of the cleanup in the first couple years to improve upon it. And we'll also have a process in place that's clearly laid out on how we'll update performance standards, and we'll update things that, based on lessons learned as well. And lastly, this plan needs to obviously have a communication plan. How are we communicating the results of the monitoring to the community? And we'll ensure, putting in a point of contact in place for community members to reach out if they have concerns, We'll be using existing tools that we have, things like the story map, things like websites. So we obviously want to use our communication tools, see if there are additional communication tools that we can really have to kind of communicate this, get constant feedback on it, improve upon it, and be very transparent about it. Next slide. So here's our currently our proposed timeline for developing the community impacts mitigation plan. 2022, where we are now, we intend to scope it, have discussions with community, and this is one opportunity tonight to provide that input during our interactive exercise. We'll be having discussions with performing parties. We'll work to develop what are the elements of this plan. In 2023, we plan to initially create a draft of the plan, continue to work, get input from the community, continue to work to get input on it from performing parties. And in 2024, our plan is to finalize it, incorporate it into the enforcement agreement for the cleanup, align it with existing information sources, and incorporate it into kind of the standard operation of the site. So it's tentative, but this is kind of what we're laying out as a proposal to complete this plan. Next slide. So the next portion of the presentation is we'll be moving into that interactive activity where we hope to really get a lot of helpful ideas from folks. So encourage folks to share, and I will be turning it back over to Annie for this portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Caleb. Thank you for that great overview. And if you want to go to the next slide. And actually, we'll go to the next one too. Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into some breakout rooms. And what I'd like to do is just let you know that there were a few questions. I saw one from Laura Feldman, Doris, and Cassie Cohen. And so I know your questions were responded to by Warda for Laura and Doris. Cassie, I think EPA is going to respond to you. They're also going to be in the room with you, the breakout room, so they'll respond to you there. Just because we're running a bit short on time. So what I'm going to do is get us into the breakout rooms, and what we're going to do is move into 4. So each breakout room is going to have a facilitator, and we're going to be using an online tool called Mural to collect your feedback tonight on what you think will be the impacts that may affect you during the cleanup and which ones rise to the top of your priorities. And so you'll have a facilitator in each room. We'll be taking notes for you. You'll be able to see them live on the screen, and those will also be incorporated into the notes after today. Note that you don't need to do anything. You're going to be put into these breakout rooms automatically. And this is for members only. Non-members, it's a good time for you. If you'd like to take a break, feel free to stay online, but you won't be put into the breakout rooms with the members during this time. So feel free to come back around 6:25 if you'd like to get away from your computer for a few moments. Once we return from the breakout groups, Laura Knudsen's going to provide us with a quick overview of the themes we heard during the breakouts. So feel free to stick around for that. And with that, I'm going to ask my team to go ahead and move us into the breakout rooms. And we're looking forward to hearing all your member feedback. Okay, as people are coming back, I'm looking for Laura Knudsen, just waiting for her to come back too. And we'll be sharing our screen here. I think I'm leaning to, I think, Claire, if you don't mind sharing your screen with the mural board so we can just look at the prioritized impacts that other folks shared out. And we're looking at your Zoom dialog box. We might be on the wrong screen. There we go. Perfect. No, Laura Knudsen, are you back?
I am back.
Great.
And so I took notes in my breakout room, but just going to quickly summarize kind of what I'm seeing and some of the other ones too, because we are going to be taking EPA and our team are going to be taking a look at all this after today. Yeah, Doris, I know I wish we could have more time too, but there is a breakout from 7 to 8 p.m. If you want to continue giving feedback in that space too, from this presentation. So, and this is not the end of the conversation. I want to say that this is just a first brainstorm. We'll be coming back and talking about this more because this is really important. This is just the beginning. We just wanted to introduce this concept and do some feedback generation now. So it looks like, yeah, community impact. Some of the things I heard, I'm looking at Alyssa's breakout room in the upper left-hand corner, potentially responsible party employees and operations. I also kind of heard that in our breakout room too, about businesses that are located along the river, and doing outreach, you know, to those businesses about how they might be impacted is important too. And it looks like some other things that are starred is noise, particularly at nighttime. And that was something that came up in our breakout room too, about noise, but I'm gonna call out Doug Larson in our breakout room because it was interesting talking to him about the Cathedral Park, because the railroad in that area goes by and there's already a lot of noise. So actually we were talking a little bit about how maybe in some project areas, potentially the noise from remedial action operations, mainly dredging anyway, it might be okay to have a longer work window in some areas, but then in some other areas, maybe not. Like if there's recreation going on, potentially maybe not having 24-hour dredge operations. Location of transload facilities is an important impact to consider, definitely. Air quality issues, yes, and I'm assuming that has, you know, monitoring and is tied to that. I'm assuming that discussion probably went there. And Annie, your breakout room, I'm looking at yours now. Yep. And how the contamination will impact communities, and transportation, again, rail cars, freeways, trucks, communication to communities in numerous forms. And Elizabeth in our breakout room with the port, what got cut off right as you were about to talk about that, but saying, you know, 13 years is a long time for the cleanup, and a 13-year communication plan is a lot to think about. So I saw where you were going with that, and that's I think that's kind of echoing that in Annie's breakout room. So really thinking about that up front and using this community impacts mitigation plan to think that through carefully. Effects of dredging on the river ecology. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's we'll have to think about that, because I'm not sure if that's as much of a thank you, Michael, for being here. Good night. For community impact, that's a little bit different. That's, you know, that's an ecological impact, which we're definitely going to be thinking about, but that's important. I just don't know if that necessarily is going to go in the community impact mitigation plan. Just calling that out because I see that's important though. And if you're going to want to go down to Lucila's breakout room, diesel pollution. Okay, yeah, maybe some of those videos kind of helped folks think about that a little bit, that we showed, that Caleb showed, concerns to minimize impacts and alert the community. That's an important one. So community alerts, definitely, and high quality standard technology and equipment, higher standards is important. So that's good. And I honestly, in our, I kind of tied in some of what we've heard in Pauline's room, which is where I was too. We did get some good feedback from the University of Portland in that room too, about recreational activities that are occurring there that would need to be considered in this plan, and just thinking about other recreation activities that could occur. So those are some of the highlights, but there's a lot of other things here that we're going to be looking at. So thank you all so much. Just wanted to quickly summarize, especially for observers who did not go into the breakout room, some of the things that we heard. And I'll hand it back to Annie.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so I know that was quick. We do have a whole hour to spend on this topic if you do want to just stay in this breakout room, but feel free to come and chat with us more in the CIMP breakout room between 7 and 8. Right now, we're going to go into a 5-minute break, so please feel free to go grab some water, do a stretch. We're going to turn on the Portland Harbor Collaborative Group playlist on Spotify, which we have thanks to a couple members. And we will see you back here in 5 minutes, right at 6:29, 6:30.